but it's essentially just a few. Mark, let me get my flight open.
So we are convening the first session of our pre-conference, first panel session.
Hold on.
Lauren here is. Oh, you're here now. Okay, great. Oh, fantastic. Welcome. Sure. Yeah. We can actually get you another chair.
Yeah, come over here.
Come over here.
Yeah. So ECS as a division, I think, is pretty comprehensive in terms of its approaches to its objects. And I think that this first panel, the idea in assembling these wonderful papers and these panels together was to kind of highlight some different approaches from different perspectives. I think each one sort of shows us a nice different way on how ECS as a thing, as a sort of area, the different approaches that are available. So without further ado, we've got 5 panelists: Paul Elliott Johnson, University of Pittsburgh; David Carlone, University of North Carolina at Greensboro; Crystal Colombini, University of Texas at San Antonio; Lauren here at Hill College; Daniel Falstick of Oregon State University. And I think we'll just go in that order unless there are any objections. So first up, we have Paul Elliott Johnson, The Social Blob: Collapsing Economics, Culture, and Politics.
Thank you for the introduction. Thanks, everybody. I'm excited to be here supporting this economics pre-conference. And the title of my paper refers to the, I suppose you might say, mental or infrastructural collapse of the various formations or elements of society, civil society, the market, the state, the church, into more or less one amorphous blob, which we would understand as society, but temporarily to capacity to understand. We would say that our understanding of it is actually as if it is the market. Right? So the move by which, at one point, there was a competition between multiple vectors in society for the contestation of resources and influence, and the collapse of that in favor of the market as a sort of a measuring stick, or the sole vector that's used to measure the truth. So in this talk, I want to inquire a bit about the public-facing elements of humanized economics, and to generate a linkage and perhaps point to a relationship between the public-facing economic humanism of our moment, I use that term, it's an insult, and some of the origins of the discipline's attempts to engage in humanizing economics, embedded in the Iowa Project of Productive Inquiry from the 1980s, earlier speeches. I'll proceed in a few steps. First, I'll highlight some of the ways the early Polaroid Project that was based on skepticism and modernity. Second, I'll rely on critics of liberalism to point out how these motivations can be co-opted by this sort of shift in our cultural understanding of capitalism. And finally, I'll briefly discuss how contemporary advertising campaigns humanize the market for to achieve their ends. So the broader Polaroid Project never sought to displace the existing expertise within the fields to which its authors articulated themselves. As Nelson, McGill, and McCloskey suggested in their Polaroid launch essay, the goal is to show the humanism already abiding within various disciplines that appear to be caught up in positivism: the natural sciences, social sciences, and of course, within this, economics. What these critics took to be an obsession with statistics and numbers no doubt resonated with a number of threads in the humanities, whether Richard Weaver's fear of monopolist consumer culture, Frankfurt School's worries about mass society, and of course, Kenneth Burke's own skepticism about democratization. McCloskey's narrative of economics stands as a proper example of the Polaroid Project. It repudiates relativism while remaining critical of the tendency in statistical economics, carried forth by our keynote today, to take the unrepresentability of the human by data sets as proof of the irrelevance of the creative element of human life to the realm of economic content. So something observed as opposed to something truly reflected. For McCloskey, aggregate growth numbers or eloquent analogies about purchasing power are both examples of, quote, human reason and should be treated as such. The embrace of statistics as the only form of rationality constitutes a restricted methodism, which replaces those facts and reasons beyond reasoning, refusing to offer hostages to evidence. The Polaroid Project offers a way to look at economics talk in a way to make it better. Were economists to give up their quaint modernism and open themselves to a wider range of discourse, they would not need to abandon data or mathematics or precision, but would merely have to acknowledge that mathematical data are one form of proof available to the thinker. For McCloskey, economics was, up until a certain point, internal to the human. And it was only when it bought into a certain version of extreme modernism, i.e. the idea that all phenomena could be objectively observed outside of itself, that it lost its way. As she puts it, probable argument was kept subordinate to certitude, as we encountered what was in Rorty's view the triumph of the quest for certainty over the quest for wisdom. So this is why McCloskey says economics must be thoroughly complex. However, humanizing the economic is not only the territory of the Rorty collective. One can see the echoes of the idea of humanized economics in earlier texts, whether in Alexander Lousteau's idea of vital politique, the centrality of the term human capital as mainstreamed by Gary Becker, and the politics and the rhetoric of Ronald Reagan, who very famously, I think, and quite successfully, constituted a kind of new American mass public around the idea of an economized American people, defined through the shared culture and commitment to consumerism and industriousness. So the issue, right, is what if McCloskey, McGill, and Nelson each suggested, right, that we should rescue economics from positivism, but the economists themselves came to be seen as the heralds of the one true humanism, that is, the humanism of the market, understood as civil society, right, collapsed into one formation. So I'll move to that to explain a little bit further. There's not time here to rehearse whatever transition occurred from liberalism to late liberalism, right, more problematic than I think liberalism. And to be honest, most of the audience is probably sick of hearing leftist rants about late capitalism ad nauseum. I'll simply say that I have the following assumption, which is that public discourse struggles to register thinking about the market and the population in our contemporary society as separate entities, and it is this cultural shift that is so ably discussed by folks like Margaret Summers, Michel Foucault, and Philip Murawski, each of whose work sort of informs in various ways this brief section. Where the Pomeroy originators did not seek to displace economic authority, Foucault observes in The Birth of Biopolitics, the economy had no such qualms regarding the displacement and redefinition of political authority. When I refer to the economic here, I consider it as a technology for thinking the way that Foucault does, as an entity that helps organize our understanding of the arrangement and order of society by revealing something like a truth. As he observes, this was not always the case. The market once struggled against other interests. This does not mean that there were not moments in the past at which market and societal interests converged, only that this coincidence was not necessarily assumed to express a deeper kind of truth. The market functioned as an entity, but constrained through its implication and relationship with other forces. So the birth of biopolitics refers to the generation of the new concept of population, which simultaneously condenses and contains the market and population into one figure, one which redistributes argumentative presumption on the side of the market economy, installing any policy or action's economic effects as the central benchmark to be used in evaluating the merits of a given proposal. In short, we might be tempted to say that the economic occludes the human, except that because here we are dealing with Foucault, we should be wary of implying anything like a covering over. Rather, we are observing the redefinition of the human, folded and fit inside of the market, which is now constituted as what he calls a site of veridiction, that produces truth itself. Right? An example, when Mitt Romney invokes corporate personhood, one can understand this as a strict kind of fact-finding based on Citizens United. But there would be additional way of reading that discourse too, as if to say, corporations are people because they are made up of them, and moreover, the interests of those within the corporation and their presence within society, which it helps to constitute, right, means that the interests of those corporations and the interests of the people, the population of a given country, can't be disarticulated from one another. So, governments say that one of their important tasks, maybe their central important task, is to grow and protect the economy today. Right? That's one kind of public interest that claims to be a part of multiple different public interests, but very often in practice is the sole existing public interest. To the extent that whether or not a policy is going to have a negative or positive effect on growth comes to index the desirability of a policy or not. And then, of course, you can see, too, the way that this works at a grander scale, such that if a nation's economy is doing well or a nation's economy is doing poorly, it's taken to be an index of the kind of quality and capacity of the human capital of the population. Right? It could be either treated thus as a country or a nation failing to achieve whatever its potential is, or, right, when, as you put it, some people are sort of kicked out of the market for failing, it's rendered or naturalized as something that those, that population, therefore that country, that continent deserves. Right? So Tom Frank calls essentially the way this plays out in vernacular discourse, or in the popular trust of markets, right? You might think of something like James Surowiecki's Wisdom of the Crowd, all sorts of discourses that invoke the idea that the market has chosen this, so therefore it must be the optimal outcome, which I think refers to the fact that we can never tell, right? When we measure one equilibrium against some other equilibrium, we can't determine where that equilibrium occurred in reaction to other equilibriums. The equilibrium is where it is in a certain kind of way because that's what the market says it is. So that's true. Is it good? Is it bad? Who cares, right? It's true. So don't get to arguing, get to constituting otherwise, because at least it'll still be true, but it would be otherwise. It's a sort of very complicated side of game. And I'd recommend Komorowski's The Never Let a Crisis Go to Waste as a sort of moves to the brighter side of the comments. So, right, these preferences the market express in a given moment don't simply express the will of the market, but society's judgment on the given issue, right? So the aggregated individual choices accumulate to a preference that would say, here's who we are, and this is who we are. So I want to sort of turn now to think about this market populism as it gets expressed in an advertisement. So this ExxonMobil ad that's been going around mimics some other ones, like Walmart has done recently, among others. But I want us to sort of, and I'll sort of do a brief reading of it to say, how is this expressing this idea that the population and the economy are sort of one and the same? So in thinking about the ad's context, one should consider not only the ongoing movements pushing for investors and endowments to disinvest in fossil fuel companies, but also the ongoing oil and gas boom, and the environmental anxieties it's bringing to local communities, not to mention the global context of environmental crisis. The ad opens with shots of 8 individuals, shot mostly solo, confounding the expectations of the idea of the American worker present in the American mass public. The images defamiliarize what counts as blue-collar labor by having only one white male amongst the first 8 figures, many of whom read as female and black. The last such of the introductory images is a black woman who holds up a sign reading, "We are energy." Even if our politics in 2017 appear maximally non-inclusive, you can trust the economy to include all. Each individual stands in front of various industrial business settings, which are rendered visually as fuzzy and dull compared to people who are sharp, robust, almost shiny. There's no base materialism at this work site. The score is all claps and tambourines, the kind of twangy country western guitar riff from a Dodge truck ad set on an oil rig. And the next sign that appears specifies the energy of America, where a woman stands in front of 2 helicopters. The next sign, following immediately, features a man holding a sign saying, "Powering a manufacturing revival." ExxonMobil's workers, worker energy and literal energy become entangled, difficult to distinguish from one another. And then the next 2 signs say the industry behind jobs and 10 million jobs. So it's kind of creating ExxonMobil as a corporation as indistinguishable from the people who work there, and also indistinguishable from the broader context of the economy. So I'm out of time, and I'll leave it there, but I will sort of leave you with this provocative image, which is just a kind of bizarre resonance I saw between 2 of the signs, between the sign printed in the ad and the stenciling these others, and wondering what extent these kinds of motifs are mutually informative. So I'll leave it off there, but thank you very much.
Next up, we have David Carlone with Critical Organizational Communication and Work at ECS.
I'll stand so you can perhaps see me better. I don't need it. So as the title suggests, I come at this from organizational communication, critical organizational communication. So I want to sort of reflect on some of the tools and lessons that I think critical org comms can offer the work of ECS as we think about laying out some possible trajectories and programs of research for the division. So I would hope that one part of the work of the ECS division can be to add to what I often see as more macro level analyses. We could add more micro and meso level analyses of people actually doing communication in the economy. So we could actually examine actors, whether they be individuals or more likely groups or corporations. We could examine those actors as they actually perform the relationship, whatever it might be, between communication and the economy. And I think critical organizational communication, I think, does this, can do this, can aid us in doing this. We are very much about examining micro and meso level contexts. Not entirely, this kind of what we often do. And I think this focus on micro and meso level analyses can really remind us that there are many possible relationships between economics and communication, and that it's really exploring actual sites where we see some of that variability. There might certainly be themes across them, but as people do this, we see what they're actually doing, and that adds can add a lot of nuance to our understanding. So I wanted to kind of briefly offer some. How many of you call yourself a critical economist? I think you're mostly rhetoricians, maybe. Okay. Well, I kind of assumed that would be the case. You can, if it's not the case, feel free to holler out. I kind of assumed that would be the case, so I thought I would offer some kind of things we orient to, which I suspect you're familiar with, because you all had an org-com course at some point, I know, and I recall my rhetoric classes. But then I'll kind of offer some lessons for sort of internal to the discipline, some lessons that might kind of extend our reach. So what is critical organizational communication? The org-com scholars are really interested in sort of how people communicate around a few key features, how people handle issues of differentiation of tasks and functions, how people create and coordinate toward goals, goal orientation, how people handle questions of control, which by that we mean not control in a power sense, but control more in terms of just coordination, the need to fit in with others. That's kind of what we orient to, and then we add on to that the power relations around that. So a common question we might ask is something like, how are possibilities enabled and constrained as interdependent people, actors, communicate to differentiate tasks, establish and work toward goals, and coordinate themselves? It's kind of an ongoing question that we have. Whether concerned with decision-making and the function of high-performance work teams, the regulation of identity, or coordinating amidst difference, we are very interested in diagnosing illegitimate constraints on communication, and then, of course, proposing prescriptions for opening that up for democratic participation. I think that fits very well with the work of the division, the work that we kind of do collectively. So the most the thing I'd highlight here is that at a kind of a general level, what does this offer, this kind of definition offer ECS? Well, one way to understand ECS, the work we might do in this division, is that economics and communication are an ongoing project of organizing. We're an ongoing project of organizing in local settings, at least somewhat local settings, where people are engaging with one another around how to differentiate tasks, how to craft goals for themselves, how to engage in coordination. So again, it sort of takes this macro level focus and brings it down to a level where we can actually see people kind of doing this with whatever constraints and possibilities they might have. So what can critical organizational communication offer ECS in some more specific ways, and then kind of how we can kind of maybe link to others. So bringing elements of this research program of critical org-com into ECS, again, is very much about local, meso, micro, nuance, that kind of thing. Critical org-com, I think, is particularly useful at moments of transition, and I think this is a kind of moment of transition, or that might depend on how we punctuate things, but transition from a policy, transition in terms of the kinds of work, at least in the US, that people are performing or not performing. So I think critical org-com is useful for examining moments of transition like this, for again, how people are actually doing and experiencing. How do social actors carry out this transition? If this is a moment of transition, what are we actually doing that demonstrates this as a transition point? So whether it be through methodologically, I think there's some lessons here. We rely heavily on the ground data. We really love interviews and observations and surveys and document analysis, discursive tracing. We're really engaged with those methodological methods that really open up and allow for examination of what's going on inside, for example, ExxonMobil. What do the people in that organization think about this ad campaign? How do they participate in this ad campaign? So that methodologically, I think that's something important. But it's also the case that critical work can really help us see the performance and experience of labor. So rather than situating human actors as citizens or relational partners or members of families, we can now position ourselves as labor, as performing labor. And so, for example, numerous studies of knowledge-intensive work. In critical work we tend to privilege for-profit, large corporate settings, and it's certainly the case that over the last decade at least we've really privileged knowledge-intensive work. But out of those studies of knowledge-intensive work, whether it be consulting, the provision of healthcare, high-tech software development, we notice a number of things. So on the one hand, we can see the production of surplus value, surplus labor and major surplus value. We can see the antagonisms around that. But we also see something else. We also can see the affiliations, identities, and emotional connections that are also produced along with something like surplus labor or surplus value. So very often the subjects are produced as colleagues. It's not uncommon for knowledge-intensive organizations to talk about themselves as colleagues. Well, it's often the case that they do that, in fact, sometimes act as colleagues. And they don't, they're less willing to exploit one another. They're somewhat less willing to oppress one another. And there's certainly lots of arguments to show another side of this. But as people are produced as colleagues, they often do act as colleagues, and they support one another. So critical work can illuminate the labor side of things, both in terms of value, but also ethics and so on. Now, we might conceptualize this as immaterial labor, or even better, communicative labor. So critical work can really kind of demonstrate the very form and outcome of communicative labor. So communicative labor is not one thing. It could be dialogue. It could be care for another. It could be persuasion or argument. It could be collaboration. Critical work really helps us examine the forms and outcomes of those various kinds of communicative labor. I'll come back to that in just a minute or two. So again, critical work allows us to engage those concrete manifestations of people doing, again, that relationship between communication and economy. So sort of an internal to the discipline kind of thing. But I also think that critical work begins to open up possibilities for engaging with people outside of the discipline of communication. So for example, it's very common for autonomous Marxists to invoke communication. It's very common for people in diverse economies to invoke something around communication as well. That's a point of affinity. So if it's the common or commons, or if it's a community economy, that is something that critical work is very much able to work with. Sort of like a stakeholder model from the work of Stan Dietz, for example. We can work with those. But it's also the case that a lot of those scholars, when they say communication, they don't really know what they mean by that. They don't really, that's not their thing, it's not their background. So for example, Hart and Negri often distinguish between communication and collaboration. And for me, collaboration is a kind of communication. They often equate communication and information. Again, that's a kind of communication for me. And they also say things like, if communication is information is generally good, more of that is good. I would say that that's really not the case at all. More information is often not helpful at all, just like maybe more collaboration is not often helpful. So we can really help those kinds of scholars think about the assumptions they bring to their work. We can also engage with practitioners. It's very common for practitioners to say things like, we need collaboration because that's the engine of creativity. Do they know what that means? We can engage them with that. So that's one area of scholars that we can kind of, I think, connect to, drawing on some of the lessons and tools of critical work on. We can also, the keynote suggests some possible ties to perhaps heterodox economies. So for example, organizing is often about the ongoing management or reduction of uncertainty. Organizing is often about not individuals doing this, but by definition, it's people doing this together, interdependent, ongoing process. We de-emphasize the individual, we highlight process, we highlight ongoing coordination, we highlight the very practical, the good. We don't often, in critical work, have ideals, but we often do settle for good rather than best. or something that's suboptimal. I think heterodox economists often use some of this language as well. Suboptimal, partially rational, also partially emotional. It suggests some links to, again, some outside audiences that we might want to work with here at ECS. So to conclude then, I think Critical Org Comm offers nuance and variety. It offers a good dose of pragmatism. And out of that comes a really enhanced ability to, I think, invent and intervene. It reminds us of the variety. It reminds us of other scholars we might engage with. It reminds us about human agency, that people are doing these things that we so often talk about, even if they're constrained in doing that. And it reminds us that we can kind of fulfill the promise of a lot of what we see as being the work, I think, of this division. Thanks.
Next, we have Crystal Colleen, Rhetoric and Economics in the Era of Zombie Neoliberalism.
Yes, so I wanted to talk to you. It's actually my first NCA because I've been most of my sort of brought up as a rhetoric and composition person, and but as a rhetorician in the economy, many of my humans are in communications, and so I am sort of moving more in this direction rather than just the sort of rhet column, more the rhet column sort of direction. Timer here. So anyway, I wanted to talk about something fun and which I will tell you all in just a minute. Zombies. And it's from a larger project, a paper I'm working on as a piece of it. We're sort of looking at the rhetoric of strategic default. So the idea of strategic default, the idea that people, especially after the mortgage crisis, were making, there's this division between people who were making the choice, agentively to default on their mortgages versus those who were forced into default by circumstances. And actually, though that term is probably very familiar to us now, that was actually sort of a new term with that particular moment in history. It wasn't widely used before, the idea that you would strategically default on your debt. Not that it was ever unused, it just wasn't widely used. And now we see it sort of figuring more and more debates on debt. So we talk about student loan debt, for instance, you see strategic default coming up. So I started a project on that and was really looking at what we mean when we talk about strategies. We talk about consumers as strategic actors in economic circumstances and the sort of perfect information set assumptions that are underlying that sort of talk. And in the process of that, I actually got very interested in the ways that we have thought about neoliberalism itself as a strategic force, especially since the crisis. And so this paper is kind of about that leftist sort of like neoliberal rant that we're all familiar with in terms of sort of like what does this mean from a rhetorical perspective. So I'll read a little bit of this, and I apologize, I have some eye problems with this enormous machine. It's very obnoxious, but I'll try not to stare at it too much. So as we all know, neoliberalism seemed at an apex of power near the end of the new century. But many theorizations, of course, have stressed the economic crisis of the late 2000s as a conspicuous turning point, even if it wasn't the one that initially seemed imminent, right? So it triggered disenchantment with regulatory policy, with Wall Street, heightened cognizance of economic inequality, and at first it seemed as though it would deal the political economic doctrine of neoliberalism at a more blow. And Joseph Stiglitz, who was mentioned earlier, sort of was one of those people who struck this very hopeful tone, writing that neoliberalism's embattlement and its newly visible theoretical and pragmatic failures may be what he called the silver lining in the cloud that's now hanging over the global economy. But as the intensity of public sentiment subsided, so did sort of hopes for a revolutionary shift, it seemed. Policy decisions, electoral outcomes seem to be reaffirming that free market logics remain largely intact, and this resigned conviction seems to have taken hold. What we have observed is not the demise of neoliberal political ideology, but rather its vexing ability to achieve death. And this pervasive sense of a political economic life outlived has inspired, among other conceptualizations, the sort of spate of metaphors of zombieism. Zombies, in fact, dominate an expansive array of academic as well as popular critiques, lending a lurid feel to descriptions of an uncannily tenacious doctrine. So John Quiggin is an Australian economist. His book Zombie Economics contends that despite proof of scant success and plentiful evidence of failure, the zombie ideas of market liberalism still walk among us. With the aid of gruesome imagery, his book has skulls, dripping blood, disembodied hands, clutching money. Quiggin traces fundamentalist notions like efficient market hypotheses, trickle-down economics, privatization, what Berkeley and rhetoric devotees might call broad terms of neoliberal economics, from birth to maturity to fatal blow and beyond. They sort of experience this kind of zombie building where they live beyond death. For socialist journalist Chris Harman, 21st century capitalism itself is a zombie system, seemingly dead when it comes to achieving human goals and responding to human feelings, but capable of sudden spurts of activity that cause chaos all around. Radical blogger Mark Fisher, and I'm just giving you a few examples of this, like, if you sort of collect the zombie sort of stuff, that there's a lot of it. He alleges that though neoliberalism is described that the feverish forward momentum it once possessed and nevertheless shambles on harder than ever to kill, emblematizing not necessarily public acceptance, but rather sort of this deep resignation that there is no alternative. More recently, a British writer, George Monbiot, blames the zombie doctrine for its major role in a remarkable variety of crises, including the present one. So in some places, this metaphor is sort of more implied than overt. So Colin Crouch's treatise on strange non-death neoliberalism isn't really used the metaphor of zombies, but he's talking about the strange non-death of neoliberalism, right? So sort of across the board, what emerges if you start looking at this post-crisis critique of neoliberalism is this idea that whether you're thinking about an economic model, a form of statecraft, or a system of social control, or some combination of all three, we have entered this sort of post-life cycle phase. So thinking about this idea of zombies and this idea of zombie economy, zombie neoliberalism, zombie capitalism, such contentions no doubt resonate in our cultural moment. We live in this sort of world where popular apocalypticisms include zombsession, right? This is what we call in blogosphere zombsession. For Robert Saunders, zombies are metaphors of illicit globalization. They provided a long-standing narrative tool for exposing concerns about international relations and domestic social problems, especially capitalist instabilities. He says their recent popular resurgence is revelatory of this pervasive social anxiety, including heightened concerns for the dangers of invasive alterity associated with uncontrolled spaces and the current era of globalization. For literary scholar Annalee Newitz, zombies are among capitalism's iconic monsters which cannot tell the difference between commodities and people. So basically, theories of post-crisis neoliberalism are cleverly exploiting the rich tradition of zombies as figures of capitalism to refigure capitalism itself. And of course, in doing so, they also call on other symbolic powers that belong to zombies as one among the broader class of monstrous tropes, as a quintessential example of what some call myths and metaphors of enduring evil. Joshua Gunn, who draws on the work of Edward Ingebrigtsen to talk about the rhetoric of political demonology, he explains that power thusly. He says, declaring something or someone as evil or possessed by evil, a monster, is part of an American political fantasy that establishes or prioritizes certain beliefs, attitudes, and values in relation to some governing norm and to the destruction of the abnormal. Like other such ready-made cultural signifiers, zombies dehumanize and demonize, dichotomize and normalize. As phantasmal stand-ins for the destructive ideas and consequences of capitalism, they also interpose abnormative distinctions, including between a living and an undead economic order. So zombies are a fittingly macabre avatar for the proposition that neoliberal rationality should no longer hold sway, yet do, albeit in some way altered form. Metaphors are still something that, of course, in rhetoric and any kind of linguistic studies, we have long talked about, is something we should give some consideration to, right? So Dieter Pulaski, of course, began to establish decades ago that metaphors are suasive stylistic features of economic discourse. But beyond signaling just the rhetorical nature of market theories and explanations, they are also rich linguistic, manifestations of ideology that function across discursive contexts, including in the realms of popular and academic market commentary, to have consequences, affect judgment, shape the way we sort of view the world of the market. So I think it's worth us asking how the figure of the zombie may not only embody the tensions of neoliberalism, but also as an unvalid trope within criticism, condition our understandings or other people's understandings of what post-crisis neoliberalism is. Like other declarations of monstrous evil, the zombie metaphor engages in a form of political destruction, maligning aberration by way of normative juxtapositions. Two, I think, are especially salient here. The existing contrast between neoliberalism and an unspecified alternative, whatever we want instead of neoliberalism. We know we want something else, right? We don't know necessarily always what that is, but we want something else. And then this new contrast between a living and an undead version of a neoliberal political economy. So what I think then is that zombie metaphors enact a specific progressive fantasy by performing the rhetorical destruction of a twice deviant economic order. So in my paper, I've been looking at the idea of strategy. What is it? What are we talking about? What are sort of the rhetorical manifestations of strategy rhetoric? So we talk about actors as strategic. We talk about neoliberalism as strategic. And I've been playing with critical terms from Aristotle's physics, particularly energia and kinesis. So energia is actually closer to, it sounds like energy, but it's actually closer to action, the idea of sort of being at work. Kinesis, of course, is the idea of motion or movement, including the movement from potentiality to actualization that anchors Aristotle's theory of change. And both of these terms have sort of had a renaissance in rhetorical scholarship of various sorts, from sort of like tech com to sort of more rhetorical theories of agency and performance. And Ralph Strumby, of course, he and Fritz talked about energy as well, right? So there's so these are two terms I think, and I'm not 100% convinced. I haven't convinced myself yet that these two terms are the only ways to think about this. But what I notice when we talk about strategy, we talk about strategic actors, we are often talking about their volition their motion, the way that they move in the world, the way they have intention and capacity to think before they move in the world. And so this sort of zombie neoliberalism is a great example of this. Once human, zombies are products of physical and metaphysical transformation, where the latter is more complete. The necrotic, the body remains essentially familiar with the zombie. We recognize zombies because they look like humans who are dead, or because they look like humans that we know to be dead, right? And we just can think of, I'm sure, lots of zombie shows where all of a sudden someone we know is alive now is dead, and we can tell if they're dead because they don't look like they did, but they still look like they did, right? So zombies defy their former humanity most profoundly, Kevin Boone writes, in the absence of some metaphysical quality of their essential selves. And this typically conscious will, not always, but typically conscious will. Now, vicious and reactive, the zombie by agency lacks definition, or lacks agency by definition. So the Oxford English Dictionary, for instance, describes zombies as a creature capable of movement, but not rational thought. So zombie movement betrays the absence of rational thought singularly. It's so familiar as to be codified, right? If you look up like zombie walking, right, you're going to get a pretty specific list of rules about what zombies do when they walk. Zombie kinesthesia is sort of its own rhetoric of walking dead, that composes the physical and mental corruption of the rational actor, replacing strategy with opportunism, volition with instinct, coordination with this clumsy yet monstrous predation. So as a critical metaphor, zombies kind of compose our thinking of neoliberalism similarly, right? Across discussions of the doctrine of zombie phase, we see this clumsy kinesthesia that concedes to a fundamental transformation of its energy, its ability to sort of be at work in the world. So Crean, for instance, writes again that zombie ideas lumber around the intellectual landscape. Fisher, again, deprived of the feverish forward motion they once possessed. Jamie Peck concurs that the brain of neoliberalism has long since ceased functioning, though he sees some vulnerability in the ever more maladroit reflexes, he says, the living dead of the pre-market revolution continue to walk the earth, that with each resurrection, their decidedly uncoordinated gait becomes even more erratic. So we start thinking about this in terms of sort of volition and movement. We start to really see what, sort of like the limitations and the capacities of this idea of sort of zombie neoliberalism. So if it's more vicious, sort of mindlessly so, devoid of what Peck describes as the compromise, calculation, and contradiction on which neoliberal practices have sort of so I'm almost out of time. But of course, I think my suggestion to this would be that the concern with any kind of metaphorical norm is when it sort of structures of politics of recognition or problematic politics of recognition. If we sort of see this as a fixed idea, if we see too much of it, we might sort of start thinking about political economy in this undead form, recognizable, potentially fierce, not terribly cunning. And that sort of is at odds with the way other people have conceived of changes in political economy at this moment, including that the crisis has actually permitted more and deeper neoliberal restructuring rather than a sort of stall to that, right? And people feel differently about this, right? The way that people have conceived of Donald Trump's presidency, for people like Naomi Klein, for instance, he is the sort of ultimate realization of the neoliberal political economy, right? Whereas other people see him as a deviation from neoliberalism as we know it, business as usual neoliberalism, right? So there's a variety of different ways of thinking about that, but and I don't particularly think that rhetoric has fallen prey to this metaphor, but I do think it's worth thinking about, when we talk about political economy, the way that we ourselves conceptualize and rhetoricize it as a strategic or agenda. So that was I thought that wasn't too incoherent because it's sort of a short version of something longer, but anyway, zombies, yay. And when I say, when I talk about it being sort of a progressive fantasy, I mean, even though it's very fulfilling and sort of fun, I guess what I mean to say is that it's maybe a little bit problematic, right? So it sounds fun to talk about the zombie thing, but maybe we should do it.
Next we have Roland Muir, Constituting Economic Policy Communication.
What's that?
Hi, good morning. I am really happy to be here. I sat on an airplane for way too many hours to be here, so I would not have come over for this big conference. So thank you to the organizers. I'm really excited to get a bunch of people who are doing this individually into the same room and start thinking about the ways that an ECS division can begin grappling with some of the issues that have been discussed in political science, economics, and the communication literature. So my paper today is called Constituting Economic Policy Communication. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at Hope College, and I'm also finishing up. I'm a doctoral candidate at Purdue University as well, so you can kind of find me in both courses. So I'm going to define what I'm calling economic policy communication for you, talk about the different connections between political science, economics, and communication, and identify some different areas of potential intersection that I think we as communication scholars should be thinking about and grappling with, and talk about some of the theoretical implications of thinking in this way. So to start out, what do I call economic policy communication, and why did I even start thinking about this? So I came out of an undergraduate degree where I was really interested in the financial crisis and quickly realized, well, if I get a PhD in political science, there's not so many of those jobs and I'll probably be unemployed. So I got a master's in public relations, and my last class, I ran into this area of financial public relations. And I was really interested in the ways in which organizations can talk about their financial performance. And the extension to that for me was connecting this back to more of this political science thought of institutions like the Federal Reserve. The Fed talks about the economy. What do they say? How do they say that? How does that impact how we interpret the future performance of the economy? So I started thinking about these things, and one of the pieces for me that really got me to conceptualize economic policy communication was this idea that the Fed, it needs not only the public and the markets to listen to what it's saying, but we have to act accordingly in response to what it's saying. And Holmes is a sociologist, and he wrote a really interesting book called, I believe it's Economy of Words. So I'd be happy to share that citation with you, but it was a really interesting read that made me start thinking about this. And if you look at different strands of literature, for example, the presidency and bankers and large Wall Street banks have been not heavily conceptualized, but we've looked at and asked what are their role in our economic system? How do they shape our interpretations of what's going on? But we do have social actors like the Federal Reserve, who I would argue is a huge economic actor, that we've started thinking to an extent about what the Fed says, but not necessarily looked at, for example, the ways a president can discursively lead the economy. We've not done those same types of work looking at the Federal Reserve. So this led me in thinking about these issues to define economic policy communication as communication that shapes economic and monetary policy and expectations. And I argue that it seeks to explain how these major social actors like the Federal Reserve, governmental officials, economic actors, even journalists socially construct and enact economic expectations about the performance of our economy. So I pulled in the paper from existing literature in political science, economics, and communication. What I'm going to go through is by no means extensive or exhaustive, but want to get you guys thinking along the same lines as I have been over the past couple years about this. So to start with, political science has definitely contributed to an understanding of economic discourse and how it's used by actors like the Federal Reserve. But even more so, presidential leadership of the economy has been an area that's also been studied with some contradictory findings. But one study I found really interesting was Wood in 2007 was interested in looking and measuring how the tone, so positive, negative, neutral sentiment, shaped how the president was able to lead the economy and our understanding of how it was doing. So, for example, he found that regular presidential attention to the economy, okay, so this is the president talking about the economy when he's speaking not just before Congress, but in front of journalists and in front of other key economic actors. This actually increases the president's approval ratings, and it also produces healthier conditions for economic growth, employment, prices, and fiscal outcomes. Right, and that's just talking about the economy. So he also found that speaking often and optimistically helps to foster this positive echoing that earlier bullet point. So I argue and he argues if the public looks to the president to signal or interpret future domestic economic performance, a lack or loss of presidential economic credibility could lead to loss of an ability to discursively shape economic expectations. So economics has absolutely looked at some of these issues, and they have begun to argue for the incorporation of communication in the conceptualization of economics. And we clearly have a whole area of economic rhetoric and economic discourse. And so I've pulled a couple sites here where they've identified rhetoric as a way to create economic reality. Markets are constituted through discourse. So, for example, future economic activity is a cause of uncertainty that scholars and practitioners work to interpret and predict. And then extending it a little bit farther to policy, okay, so some of the critique of the rhetoric of economics is that academics have a very technical language when approaching the rhetoric of economics, right? But economists have to turn around if they're consulting or maybe they're practitioners. They have to persuade policymakers and other lay publics about the merits of their economic idea, proposal, theory, so on and so forth. And so economists have to adapt their economic language to an extent to a knowledgeable and an uninformed public. And the highly technical language is stripped away when economists practice and consult. So Goodwin argues this makes economists more effective, right? So economics not only is talking about the rhetoric of economics, but also arguments are being made that there are major pieces of persuasion in the practice of economics that we're not taking into account necessarily in our literature and our understanding of economic communication. And then, of course, I do remiss to not mention McCloskey. And she argues that ignoring the influence impact of language and economic thought and performance is a detriment, and that economics is really much too entrenched in its modernist traditions. So she called on economists to move past just conceptualizing economics as a mathematical formula to one that accounts for its role in shaping the economic expectations of individuals and institutions. And I also think that this is perhaps where some of the rhetoric of economics gets tripped up too, right? A lot of economists talk in this highly technical language with mathematical formulas, but discourse and rhetoric is sort of a different approach to what it means to know. So figuring out ways to bridge these two traditions, I think, would be very important moving forward. And then the communication literature, I think that this idea that within economics, between practitioners and academics, there's a bit of a disconnect, right? Academics have this very technical language, whereas practitioners still can speak in that way, but have to adapt that to a lay audience, to policymakers, and so on and so forth. I argue that communication is the bridge between these areas, and so we need to be bringing communication into this. And here's another site that makes a similar argument. Scholars have definitely identified a high barrier of entry for communication scholars, right? So when I started getting into this area, I was like, I'm not an economist. How am I even going to parse through what some of this means? So there's definitely a high barrier of entry, but some scholars have called on us to begin thinking about cross-disciplinary collaboration leading to more progress. And also thinking about areas of mutual interest, so things like media economics, communication policy, and economics of communication industries. Organizational communication, as we absolutely just heard about. I also really am intrigued by this idea of the social construction of economic realities, and then I think political communication absolutely has a role to play in this as well. So looking for ways as a division that we can be making these connections, I think is really important. So in my paper, I draw some additional intersections and have some implications for what this means for the practice of economic policy communication. So I think looking at presidential leadership of the economy, I'm looking at this from a communication perspective, and perhaps even putting in some ideas like social construction would be a very interesting future direction. I'm sort of particular to the Federal Reserve myself, but I think that that would be a really fruitful area to do some communication cross-disciplinary research in. The narratives of growth and recession, I think also this idea that to an extent, we have these key social actors who are saying, not we in this room, but the American public, for example, may not necessarily know how to recognize what's a growth pattern, what's a recession pattern. So instead, thinking about how do we talk about these and how does that frame the lay public's interpretation of the economy and its performance. The privileging of economic interests. So this idea that, with the financial crisis, we had these very complex financial instruments that, if you look at like a movie like The Big Short, right? I don't know if any of you have seen that, but they have, supermodels sitting in hot tubs drinking champagne to describe mortgage-backed securities because it's such an uninteresting topic for, general America. So what does that do? How does that privilege those with access and understanding and knowledge about the economy and these financial tools? And then what does that do to perhaps the working class or middle class of America? I think that's absolutely an area to think about. And then extending off of that, the Federal Reserve and this idea that more transparency from the Federal Reserve chairman like Bernanke and Janet Yellen is a good thing. Also breaking down, well, the Fed does enjoy a certain role of mysticism pulling from a more rhetorical tradition. By having more transparency, does that sort of pull the veil back on the Federal Reserve, its inner workings? What does that do to our ability to trust the Federal Reserve? And does that lead to different conceptualizations between the effectiveness of a chairman like Alan Greenspan to a chairman like Janet Yellen? I don't know, but I think that would also be an interesting future direction to go. So my argument for utilizing a framework or theoretical framework like economic policy communication is that there is such increasing interdependence between banks, financial organizations, and global economics is more volatile than ever. So we have to start thinking about this and working towards an understanding of how communication impacts the economy and how, even more specifically, it impacts economic expectations, I think is a really important direction to be thinking about. And I think this extends to areas of policy in the financial sector. So theoretical implications. I think that communication scholars have the ability to make theoretical arguments so that even if we cannot, create a mathematical formula that would perhaps appeal more to a traditional economic modernist approach, we can begin theorizing about these things to lead into a direction that encourages more cross-disciplinary work and encourages economists to begin thinking about these ideas. So here's my contact information. I'm happy to share my paper with you. It gets into much more detail. I'd be happy to share any of the sources in there or just hear your ideas in general feedback about it. So thank you so much.
Our next and final for this session is connecting media industry to criticism.
All right, so the paper as such I would be telling you about is the introduction to my book, Selling Social Media. There's an entire section devoted to the idea of attaching economic criticism to media industry's theory. In that section, I particularly turn to my favorite assorted quotes from Paul Samuelson, his earlier work, especially his ideas about the mind's eye as a primitive and I quote differential analyzer, in addition to a lot of work, especially by Benjamin Graham, which intentionally confuses business and economics as metaphysically distinct academic disciplines and their assumptions of a closed versus an open system. And I think it's a really important economic insight about the American public that folks are very willing to accept open systems arguments that could assume exponential growth and then tie those on to the sort of scientific authority that comes with closed metaphysics of mathematics. And thus the book proceeds in that way. I also think Benjamin Graham is very important in this sense because his attachment to Columbia in that time period where people were moving rapidly between apartments. I can't verify all the various things he claimed to be involved in, like teaching French literature, which would mean he was literally probably in the same meeting with Dewey. But who even knows? That's just fair. Just say a few things. So first, media industries theory. The primary conference where you will find practitioners of this is the Society for Cinema and Media Studies, or SCMS. Their meeting is basically tied to the UCLA quarter system. So when their spring break is, that's when their conference is. Which I'm on quarters at Oregon State, so it syncs up sometimes, so I can be there. But if UCLA starts a week later than we do, it's not happening. Then turn off honestly. There is a body of books. They primarily came out of Indiana University and Michigan and a few other places starting in the 1980s. And they have a different set of assumptions and uses of economic theory than people in communication studies more on this side. Practitioners in this area have told me at times they want more rhetoric. They've also told me that, and I quote, they will not be early adopters of the Natural Communications Association. So we do not see them here. And they will only show up here if they have to for department chair related reasons. So they're over there and they're doing some really interesting stuff. Here's what they do. They tend to, and I tend to, and you see this in the book, utilize ideas from economics then to describe particular facets of organizational behavior. And sort of underlying resource that they regularly turn to is Becker's 1975-ish book, Art Worlds, to look at the necessary use of ranking systems and making sense of the largely irrational world of demand modeling for media products, especially television products. Another key source they turn to is a 1991 Journal of the American Sociological Society article by Bowlby and Bowlby that does studies that ask people in television decision-making roles what's going to be a hit. Then they compare what they said at upfronts, which is where 90% of television ads are sold for the year, by the way, and then they see the changes in their discourse. So they use it like a natural experiment. They ask before, they see the upfronts, and then they see how they retroactively narrativize the decisions that they made or did not make. Basically, they can't model demand. So these practitioners then say demand modeling is impossible for any number of reasons. So then they find different ways to assume a strong vision of scarcity and then to explain organizational behaviors on the basis of that scarcity. If you're looking for the most modern citation you see of this, it's Richard Cave's 2000 book, Creative Industries. The footnotes in that are spectacular, and they'll take you to every key source that they want to use from economics to make this work. This theory stands in juxtaposition to another theory in that world, which is based on what's called convergence, which then cites the work of French philosopher Pierre Levy, who then fairly heavily cites Friedrich Hayek to assume a self-organizing system and a relatively rational model, or a self-organizing model of media industries. So you have these different models then that are arguing their way out in this other communication discipline that you may or may not have colleagues in. Here's the crisis that we are finding. And I'm finding this right now as I'm teaching a large lecture 101 version of this at Oregon State. We are based on the assumption of scarcity, and we have not done a good job of turning back to understanding what is happening with the glut. So I teach Kahneman and Tversky because that underlies so much of the post-Tupper television economics research, the massive feelings of loss or whatever else. How do I make sense of a world where Netflix is allowed to lose $2 billion a year? And that, in fact, some of their public-facing statements have said that they believe that losing more money in terms of real cash flow is actually positive for the organization. What do I do with that? What do I do with the theories of constraints, say, that come from Christine Becker's wonderful article, FinCEN Begin Again? She's a professor at Notre Dame, working on really interesting ideas about regulation and television text creativity, which would suggest that regulations and restraints and the idea of FinCEN, which required people to actually take outside bids and buy television programming, made them more creative. What do we do then in a world where there is no barrier, where the glut is happening basically continuously? There are some folks suggesting, based on the new assignment patterns in the newsrooms of Hollywood Reporter and Variety in the past 3 weeks, that the glut has changed how entertainment coverage will happen in the industry. Now, will this get us, especially in a world where finally the long-standing open secrets of power, of sexual violence in the industry are finally on the surface? Will this bring a more democratic distribution of power and access? We don't know. But the fact that the glut has disarticulated that necessary relationship between the press and those organizations is really interesting. We'll have to investigate. So what does this mean methodologically for media industry studies? 3 things tend to happen. First, field work. People who work primarily in this and publish books in it are very into going to negotiations, being a fly on the wall, and getting into the discourses. So the organization of my book is around key terms, and then it's organized almost as if it would be an ethnographic field work, but my work primarily relies on financial documents. So then reading 10K forms, reading 10Q forms, going in and looking at the ways those public-facing statements work, and then juxtaposing those with, say, the public relations statements those companies make. To then see the kind of affective work that's being done to persuade people about the value and potential that's in any of these organizations. Technical studies, so they use a version of actor network theory to then talk about the ways that individuals' work lives are constructed by tools like Final Cut Pro. I remember when I was on the job market, now 7 years ago, getting pushback at my job talk because I said that Final Cut Pro caused changes in the industry. And apparently I'm not allowed to say that because apparently it's technological determinism. But yeah, definitively Final Cut Pro changed the industry and changed how businesses and everyday lives happen. Final legal studies. People then turn from the economic sort of inflection of the field toward sort of normative readings of the law. I think Pierre Schlag and other folks who critique that in some really important ways. It's also in my book. So the final sort of conclusion I want to give about potential relationships with media industries holds is they have a way of trying to understand how different media organizations operate. They have ways of trying to import different ideas from economics, but then they want to try to add on to them to explain the ways that those theories actually play out in everyday life in terms of the affective life of these companies, in terms of how they represent themselves, in terms of the sort of larger drama and narrative of the media industries. My background originally was in television studies research. Now I do social media. So I'm interested in particularly the ways that these economic statements, these uses of theories and uses of litigation tend to impact the securitization of social media stocks. So that's really what selling social media is about as a book, and where then we go. So just thinking about this in terms of differences in approach. When I turned in the book originally, it had no graphics. And the publisher and the reviewers wanted graphics. There are now 19 different charts, either process charts or equilibrium models, real live equilibrium models I got to draw that are in the book. Now, obviously, I get to work with those and talk about them and how I designed those and what they may mean. I actually think the equilibrium model that explains changing preference conditions in terms of fake news is actually pretty good. Some of the other ones, like describing the tops of Foursquare, are not as great, but they're so there are other communication fields out there that instead of turning toward necessarily trying to critique neoliberalism and use this terminology, have tried to utilize vocabulary of economics. But they now are finding themselves, and I'm finding myself through my teaching. I'm very much in an odd place here. That I can't even keep my class up quarter to quarter to deal with the underlying condition of the glut that is making so much of our underlying theory and our structure and assumption of scarcity false.
So we have 5 papers with several different approaches across them, and we're going to open it up. We don't have any personal respondent for any of these sessions. We're going to open it up for discussion, and I will be on formally moderate as needed. Thank you again to the panelists. Do you have any comments, questions, or discussion?
Yeah, I don't think this necessarily relates to research, which is interesting. You mentioned how the glut,
Yeah.
interesting talking about
Yes.
what it is.
Yes.
Just changes the way we treat scarcity. But how the glut has some role perhaps in recent revelations about widespread sort of bad acting and
So I think the best way to explain that potential relationship, and this is obviously very surface, as I'm literally talking about an article from Hollywood Reporter 3 days ago, is that previously the newsrooms of these organizations were chasing after in a very sycophantic way Hollywood. And now you have there are various sources of capital that are financing the production of television shows that are no longer tied to that traditional network of actors. You also have new financing arrangements. So there's this idea in the industry that all you need to make your platform go is a single kids show. And once you have the kids show, you can lock in a $7 a month payment from your parent. And so you'll see a dramatic increase in the role of kids programming. Now for Netflix, this is financed in one way, which is generally when they buy it. Amazon finances it by using an option contract structure, where they then offer a back-end sweetener based on future toy sales, but Amazon has to decide to make the toys, and Amazon is the manufacturer, or at least the contractor doing it. And so you have people then entering these relationships and making these sorts of content. So you have a dramatic increase in the amount of content in production. There are currently 472 television shows in production. There are some television shows now that are spending up to $8 million an hour on production. Historically, a $3 million an hour episode of Dick Wolf show like SVU was considered to be the top end you could possibly afford. Or use the Star Trek reference, the first episode of Star Trek Voyager, Caretaker, where they threw a huge amount of money, almost as much, maybe a third of Deep Space Nine. One episode of the show was considered to be a horrible investment decision. But so then we tend to teach, and people in this area tend to research and assume that there's all this fear in terms of the prospect theory curve, where you have increasing, almost exponential increases in pain. And in a world where the pain is gone, what do we do? How do I understand any of these creative or non-creative distinctions? We may need organizational communication research. Desperately. There's only so much time.
But
We're looking for a major scholar to read about Amanda Watts, the University of Michigan.
I guess I just have a question for David. I thought your talk was really interesting, and when you talk about studying how people like perform and constitute economies, like, I mean, are you thinking of like Gibbs and Graham's work there, and like sort of like alternative economies beyond like the capitalist economy, and like maybe what would some examples of alternative economies look like on the ground? I think that's a really interesting concept. That'd be interesting, like some concrete examples, maybe that are like non-capitalist or sort of parallel to capitalist.
yeah, so I do think quite a bit about Gibbs and Graham's work. There's a line in there actually I didn't say, but that definitely colors how I think about my own work in critical organizational communication. So in critical org comp, we have some examples. Well, I mean, so in terms of the variety, there are some studies of certainly capitalist org, what we say. So often the case that critical org comp scholars don't necessarily foreground economy either. It's something that we don't often do. We assume capitalism. We may or may not say that. But there are certainly studies of capitalism. There are also studies of George Cheney's work on examination of Mondragon, which he doesn't quite say this, but to me, they're non-capitalist because the socios are appropriating their own surplus. But he does talk about non-socios being hired as well. So Mondragon is an example of a non-capitalist alternative. There are certainly other studies of cooperatives. Some of those are non-capitalist, some of them are capitalist. It sort of depends on the structure of those. And again, it's not always foregrounded in the studies, but they're there. Then there are examinations of non-profit organizations, which again may or may not be sort of alternative in some ways, but maybe not in others. Then there are the shadow organizations, or the illicit organizations, which may be capitalist, but they're also maybe illegal. So then they're kind of. So one of the things interesting is sort of the definitions, I think, really begin to become, even when they're not articulated, I think one of the things we can do here is articulate some of these definitions and what do we mean when we think of alternative to capitalism or alternative within. So some of that's from Gibson Graham, but there are these studies within critical org comp as well.
That's great.
Yeah.
I have a question about zombies. Is their motion Newtonian or chaotic? Or is it scary because we don't know?
I mean, I think people conceptualize zombies in different ways. Like, we do scholarship about zombies, and it's not like precisely something I ever thought I'd really get into. I'm not like sort of, like that kind of critic normally. But again, I came to this project where I started thinking about we were talking about humans, and specifically debt management as strategic. And then I was like, started thinking about if there's this I'm using Dusanto essentially the strategy in this piece, and there's this very interesting connection between like the rhetoric of walking death, the rhetoric of walking away from one's house, and Dusanto's walking in the city. And so I'm sort of playing with connections there. And I mean, the only thing I would say, I wouldn't say that necessarily like zombie kinesthesia is always entirely consistent, but there's certainly a recognizability to it that gets described when we speak about, neoliberal, however we conceive of that, right? It's conceived in all these different ways, but we start sort of saying that neoliberalism is now a clumsy force, like it's sort of like monstrous. Predations is still scary, but like clumsy force. I mean, actually maybe like sort of like shortchanging our perceptions of things that are happening.
Everybody else is sort of very like rational. And to try to look at this from really a very metaphorical sort of position trying to understand how we think gets back to this what I was thinking about before. And I was sitting here making notes about the presumptions of complexity, which are that the agents, while they're all making different choices, are still making choices based on a local reality that made sense. And if you look at the rational paradigm, that sort of overlay of rules that would say they would all make the same decision had they all had perfect information, right? So both of those really have an underlying, one's chaotic or complex, and one is rational, but they both have this underlying assumption that there's a rule somehow, whether it's a local rule or a paradigmatic rule is sort of beside the point. And then you're introducing zombies, and I'm like, oh my God, that's the problem. They don't, walking away from the dead made no sense under either one. You walk away from the dead means that you've violated all your principles of moral behavior, and you've sort of adopted this recognition that the rules don't work. And I think that's the scary part about the zombies, is that you can't tell.
Yeah, I mean, the strategic debt question is, or the strategic default question is super interesting because, on one hand, there's not a lot of statistical evidence that strategic default actually happened. So studies that have looked at this have actually said that the vast majority of people who could pay continue to pay, and the vast majority of people who continue not to pay were experiencing sort of measurable, sort of things like job loss, divorce, whatever. But even that kind of study has to adopt some kind of method of measurement, and there's a lot of assumptions involved about what does it mean to be able to pay, and also how are we thinking about our inability to predict the future, right? So I mean, if you were affected by the economic crisis, there was a point when it seemed bottomless. There was a point when there was absolutely no way to know how long it would go. I had to short sell a house that I got for $320 at $120, more than half of its value. And 5 years later, that house is $320 again. Interestingly, I would not have thought that 5 years ago. I would have assumed it would have taken years to get back to that point in Reno, Nevada. So, making the decision to default, if it was really a decision, I think District is interesting for this reason because he lets us think about this in terms of tactics that maybe we did choose. And actually, interestingly, it's about rational action, right? In that instance, defaulting was the rational individual course. It's like the thing that works best for me in this moment, right? But of course, there was so much more rhetoric about it, right? So it really does portray this deep tension of rational action, right? That on one hand, the free market depends on this idea that people act in their own best interest, and then beautifully. On the other hand, people act in their own best interests when they defaulted, and the economy did a big dump. So it's a really interesting question, and again, the connection to this sort of zombie idea is really interesting. But it just is striking to me the way we have tried to organize our conception. I mean, sort of like I think a neoliberal, I would say, I guess, loosely, an interpretation of the crisis. Really relies on strategy. If you look at sort of all these different sorts of places after the crisis, there was a lot of talk about strategy and how people are strategizing to negotiate with their lenders and all these things. But at the same time, we've sort of adopted this vision of economic forces as sort of non-strategic, just moving with no volition. And so that contrast just perplexes me. I haven't entirely worked it out.
Even each of these presentations can provide a good foundation for a panel for next year. I think that an interesting thing that several of them we probably shouldn't be surprised that two of them are possible. And it would seem to me that might be an implied sixth panel. Reckoning at the beginning of this thing called ECS with its continued life. Maybe it's not implied. And we will now, I think, break for lunch. We have scheduled. Thank you again. Well, thank you. We are a few minutes behind. We've got scheduled about 1:30.